Hello to my Art 29A class. I hope that you guys are having a nice weekend so far. Tomorrow or today is Labor Day, so it doesn't really affect our class except because we don't have anything due today. So if we were in a regular class, I believe that our meeting times are actually Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so, yes. Um, so anyhow, let me talk about what's going to happen this week. Last week, we talked about the color wheel, and we're actually going to talk about that with a little bit more detail, and you're going to have a project that deals with it. So let's see what is going on here. Before I talk about mixing color, let's talk about some frequently asked questions that I received throughout the week. And whenever students have any questions, sometimes I feel they're pretty important and that I am guessing that many other students might have the same. So one question is, should I start painting by dipping my brush into the pigment first or into the water first? It is better to put your brush in the water first. Unless your pigment is somewhat, if it's already wet and you want to achieve a really opaque line or stroke, then you can try to dip it right into the pigment. But if you want to have more fluidity, you want to make it more transparent like the way watercolor usually is, then of course you want to add water first. And so that is one question that I have. Here is another one. How much water should be in my watercolor paint? And this is something that came up a lot, especially when students were turning in their color wheels. And there are some students that turned in assignments that had very little water, and then there's students that turned in work where it was very translucent. So this is a pretty tough question to answer. I would probably say about half. The ratio should be, you should have about the same amount of pigment with the same amount of water. So if you want to measure it with numbers, maybe if you had, say, an ounce of paint, then you want an ounce of water if you want to maintain the, the, the nicer qualities of that particular pigment. If you don't really use a lot of water, you like a lot of the opaqueness when it comes to paint, then I would probably suggest using gouache because it is more, the behavior is more of that, where it's more solid. So watercolor has its own behavior. If you realize that the transparency is what's needed, and that's actually the beauty behind the medium, then you'll realize that it's always good to have a good fair amount. So about half, 1-to-1 ratio, 1 ounce of pigment with 1 ounce of water. If you put too much water and then a little bit of pigment, you'll notice that the color isn't really that noticeable. So I would avoid that unless you're really trying to do these glazes of color and that you're trying to achieve a particular tone. It's okay to do that, but it's almost not really worth it if you have too much water and a little bit of pigment. It's like you won't even notice it. So put a good amount of pigment. And so I hope that answers that question. So how much water should be? About a 1-to-1 ratio. Because this is just one of those things that it's nicer for us to be able to see that in person. And so another question is, how wet should a paper be? Initially, I I determine this from whatever I'm going to end up making. So if I'm going to paint something that is going to cover a lot of surface, and I know that there's going to be some changes, some subtle changes of color, then I might make sure the paper is pretty wet. So the best way to go about this actually is to have a spray bottle and to basically spray the whole sheet of paper, and that should be a good amount already. You don't want it overly wet, because if it's overly wet and you start to paint, you will notice that there will be little to no detail. So you will get pigment, you'll apply it on the wet paper, and you'll notice that it spreads right away. And you don't really want that. Unless you are painting something like a sky, that is really good for something like that. But for this class, at the moment, we're not really doing that. But just keep it in mind that if you do want to end up doing a sky, it's a little bit better when the paper is already, or it's still wet. So when it comes to how wet should the paper be, say that you do want to wet the paper and that you want to do these subtle changes of color, it's good to make it wet, but actually wait about 2 to 3 minutes before you start applying pigment. So I hope that answers that question. If you don't want, say, that a particular brushstroke to appear soft, then you'll want your paper to be as dry as possible. So if you're the type, or if you like, or even if you are attempting to create a little bit more detail-oriented lines and shapes, and you want more opaqueness with color, then I would just wait for the water to be, or I would wait for the paper to be fully dry. So I hope that answers that question. How wet should the paper be? It all really depends on what your goal is. You want something with more expressive qualities, make it more wet. If you want more detail-oriented lines and shapes, then I would probably wait until it's fully dry, okay? For watercolor in general, we almost expect it to have that expressive quality. We like to be able to see through the pigment. And so another question I received was, do I always have to stretch my watercolor paper? You don't really have to stretch your watercolor paper for every assignment. It really depends on how much water you're going to end up using for that work. If you are going to do these washes, which we're going to explore, I believe, next week, you're going to notice that it is probably better for you to stretch your watercolor paper. But if you don't really plan on wetting the whole paper, then you probably don't have to do it. Yes, when it comes to stretching watercolor paper, it's a lot of work. But it's not as much work as building your own canvas if you were to do oil or acrylic. So yes, you don't have to stretch your watercolor paper for every assignment, only where you know it's going to require a wet on wet technique. And so yes, you'll realize it once we start doing, wet on wet. And then when your paper starts to buckle, you'll think, oh man, I should have just mounted this, or I should have just stapled it down to prevent it from doing that. But there's different ways to go about it. One thing that you can do is just paint, and when you're done, you can try to flatten it out. Wait till it dries and then put it in between. I would just put it in between books, So there's some ways to go around it. So, do what you feel works for you. For me, I always mount my watercolor paper on this little whiteboard that I have in the back, because I don't really like the stretching while I'm working. You could always get away with not having to do that. And so I hope that answers some questions there. So let's go ahead and talk about one of the assignments that you guys will be facing this week. So we're going to talk about 3 ways of mixing watercolor. And this is how I started this assignment. I got one of my watercolor paper pad, sheets of paper, and I basically taped it to my watercolor board. And I actually used painter's tape. I don't know if I've ever talked about this before, but if you have this, and if you're like me, I have a tendency to push down on the tape a lot. I go very heavy on it because I feel like it's gonna come off. But when you do that, it actually removes a lot of the sizing and some of the material on the paper, and it actually rips it off. So when it comes to applying something like paper's tape, don't go too heavy. I learned it the harder way. So painter's tape, you will eventually use canvas paper. You'll need at least 1 page, but if you have smaller canvas sheets of paper, just use 2. So yes, you'll see why you'll need 2 just in case. And of course, you'll be using your tubes of color. I'm hoping that you have a palette by now. And your brushes, of course. And so the first way of mixing is called the mixing in a palette. So you're basically going to have the palette that you're using, and you're going to put each pigment in its own little space. And this is the most straightforward way to mix. And you'll notice that some colors are a little bit more active than others, or the colors that we see here, the blue and the yellow, the blue is very strong. So you put just a little bit of that in the yellow, and it almost changes the whole thing. So you should always test the pigment. Not all of them have the same behavior. Okay, so yes, always use color. It is always better to just mix 2 colors and not 3 within one of your wells. I think that it's always good for you to try it anyways. Try to put 3 colors in one well, and it can get muddy really fast. So it's really safe to just mix 2 colors at a time. Okay. Yes, I learned this the hard way also. I used to paint wet on wet all the time when I painted oil, and I don't wait for it to dry. So then I would be blending all these colors, and I'm wondering, why is it turning out a bit muddy? It's really because I'm mixing too many colors too soon. It's better for me to just wait for it to dry a little bit, and then I can add glazes to influence the color that's already there. So just some thoughts. So what you're going to end up doing on the sheet of paper that you taped out is you're going to paint this example in the first rectangle. So if you have the 3 rectangles already taped out, I want you to paint this example of this mixture in a palette into that rectangle. And again, this is the most straightforward way to mix. And you're probably wondering, do you have to always mix the color before you paint it? Or can I just paint it out of the tube and just paint directly out of the tube? Well, you can do that. And if it works, it's fine. Something that I noticed when it comes to color in general, there's a little bit more vibrancy when people are mixing. It just makes the overall composition stronger. And you'll know, or you'll feel how strong work is just from how these artists are able to pull off these ways to mix. And so that's it for the mixing in a palette. Now we're going to talk about mixing on the paper. So this is a little bit I feel this is straightforward as well, except it's not used as much. And so you will want to use a round brush or mop. These brushes have a different type of behavior when it comes to picking up the pigment and then reapplying it. If you are used to doing something like a wash with a more flat brush, then you'll notice that one color will directly influence, it'll almost go over the others, but if you use a round brush, it passes through a little bit better. So it's actually a little bit more useful when it comes to wet on wet. But that's what that round brush is for. So what you're going to end up doing is start by brushing clear water over the surface. So for the second rectangle that you have on your paper, just get your, your water, put it in one of the wells and just use your brush and just put that on the paper first. So this is really the important step in doing wet on wet. So make sure that the surface is wet first. You can always use a spray bottle to keep it wet. So as you are painting, you're going to notice it's going to dry up a little bit. So you just have a spray bottle and add more if you feel like it's not mixing enough. And so yes, add these two colors on your paper directly, and we call this a wet on wet technique. So very different from mixing in a palette, where mixing in a palette is a little bit safer. You have a little bit more control over the exact colors that you are going to see. But when it comes to wet on wet, you are going for a little bit more of an expressive quality, a little bit more transitional quality from one into another. So that is mixing on paper. So yes, so again, you're going to first apply one color while the surface is wet, and then while it is still wet, you're going to apply the second color, and that's it. It's very, very basic, very straightforward. And so now we're going to talk about the third type of mixing, which is called glazing. And if you look at the images here, you can see that you have these very evenly distributed areas of paint. And when it comes to glazing, you're actually just waiting for it to dry and adding another layer on top of that. So for this technique, you can use a round brush or mop as well. You'll want to paint your initial wash by creating a continuous flow of color. So on that third rectangle that you have, create a wash. So you just want to make a continuous flow of color. So for this glazing technique, do the same thing where you're using two colors, and then start off by painting that initial wash. And so after that rectangle dries, you can actually paint the new color on top of that. And that's what this second square on the bottom, that's the way it appears. So you'll still see the cadmium red, and then you'll see this blue over it, and that you'll notice that the blue is directly influencing that red. So you have a little bit of violet in there. And say that you want a darker or a more cooler version of that color, then you're going to wait for that to dry. Or yeah, I would wait for it to dry, then add another layer of the blue, or I can add a little bit more color to that blue to make it feel darker. Sometimes I like to mix blues. Sometimes you can do something like you can create a shade of the blue and then paint that. mix a shade on the side on your palette and then apply that on top of the color so that you're directly influencing the color underneath. So glazing is a very useful technique, especially if you are trying to achieve one particular color. Say, oh, you know what? This shade of red is a little bit too light. I'm gonna try to darken it up a little bit. So then you can wait for it to dry, and then glaze it. You know what? That's not really what I want. Wait for it to dry, then glaze it. But of course, because of the translucency of the pigment, you have to be careful because you can also make it muddy even though it's already dry. And so, yes, if you have to add more pigment, then you may do so. Again, it's always really, really good, say, habit to experiment on the side before you actually paint. So for me, on my desk, I usually have my paper that I'll be painting on. I usually have my palette. I usually have my paper, my rags. And then I also have a you know an extra paper where I can experiment on. So in the end of this little exercise, it should look something like this. So you'll have 3 rectangles, and then you'll have 3 different ways of mixing. So everyone's will look different. It doesn't have to look like this in particular. So anyhow, I guess that's all I wanted to talk about to you guys today. I'm hoping that you guys enjoy the little still life project that you guys will be doing this week. So you actually have a week, you have until Friday to do one of the assignments. So it's a little bit of a bigger project. It is very much like the monochromatic work, except that I want for you to create a not monochromatic still life. I want you to create a still life that is more of a warm color palette. And I don't have the paper in front of me to read it. That's why I'm here having to think about it. And that you're going to use your own objects, and that you don't always have to stick to the real color of that object. Instead of that, you want to use a color scheme and then apply that to those objects. So I hope that works out. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Have a safe rest of your week and take care.